Hello, Patricia here, welcoming you back to the Poetry Pea. I really hope you enjoyed last week's reading by some of the poets who've had their books published by Cuttlefish Books. If you haven't listened, it's really worth your while going back to episode 48 of this 7th series and sitting down with your favourite libation to have a listen. Or maybe just plug us into your ears and these poets can keep you company for a little while you go about your day. They're a spectacular bunch of poets, and I certainly enjoyed listening to them, and as always, learned so much by just listening to other poets read their work. If you have listened, you'll know that I kept back one of the readings, that of Deborah P. Kolodji, who sadly left us this year. There's a black hole in the haiku world with her name on it, but at least we have her poetry to lighten our universe a little bit. Well, this episode is an homage to Debbie. I'm going to start it with a replay of an episode she recorded way back in 2022 on Scifiku. It's one of the most popular episodes in the podcast history, and poets wrote some cracking speculative poetry as a result of it. So you know what I thought we'd do this time? We are going to have a Scifiku submission period as the first submission period for next year, 2025. I've put a schedule up on the website. You can go directly there, or there'll be a link in the show notes too. So, without further ado, let's go and be inspired by Deborah P. Kolodji's presentation and exploration of Scifiku.
What is Scifiku? As we were discussing earlier, Scifiku is also known as speculative haiku, and is a form of speculative poetry. And speculative poetry has several themes: science fiction, fantasy, horror, and STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And it also is poetry, in my mind, the way I like to describe it, is poetry that explores what-if scenarios. And here are a few examples of science fiction. Martian Greenhouse, The Buzz of the Robot Bees by Carolyn M. Hinderleiter. Or fantasy, Bloody Spindle, Putting Another Princess Under Again by Christina Singh. Or horror, Unfaithful Husband, a toast to the flesh-eating virus in his drink by Kevin Durant. And as a STEM example, Firefly Flashes, The World Beyond Boolean Logic by Jay Friedenberg. So if we want to think about what-if scenarios, what if you visited Camelot? What would you see? Moving line of ants, the sword in the stone remains still. What if you had a time machine? Time travel dating, a rejected lover never leaves by Leroy Garman. What if an asteroid hit the Earth? First snowfall after the asteroid. No footprints by Ann K. Schwader. What if we sent criminals to the moon? Lunar prison after lights out, a transport's contrail by Joshua Gage. A haiku should present the truth as if it were fiction. This is a quote I used in my Exaggerated Perspectives talk last year. It was from Yatsuka Ishihara, at a conference in Chicago in 1995. And the idea is that that fiction can sometimes tell the truth more so than the actual occasion. And here are just a few examples. Time travel dining, a good meal is worth repeating. And I decided to think about Thanksgiving dinner, but it could be a restaurant, a meal that you like so much that you're going to travel back in time to read it again. So, there's a truth in that goes beyond the fantastical nature of time travel dining. Used spaceship lot. Dealer rolls back an odometer 800 million miles by John J. Dunphy. And, a lot of is said about used car salesmen and changing odometers, but by placing it on a used spaceship lot, it just makes it drives the point home so much more. In-laws at the door. Those panicked moments before I shapeshift by Julie Bloss Kelsey. And here, if Julie would have said in-laws at the door, those panic moments before I get dressed, or those panic moments before I put on my makeup, or those, but this idea of shape shifting actually into, it's just, there's a reality and a truth there that comes across with more emphasis than if you would have used another way of getting ready for those in-laws. Absolute zero. You couldn't have been any colder. Susan Birch. And, absolute zero is, of course, the utter coldest that it could possibly be in a thermodynamic state, the lowest point of energy. And in fact, it might even be impossible to truly reach absolute zero. But the bottom line is that and a person could never reach absolute zero because your cells would freeze and become ice crystals. But there's something about, if Susan would have said 32 degrees, you couldn't have been any colder, or 0 degrees, or negative 25 degrees, you couldn't have been any colder. And of course, I'm thinking Fahrenheit for those that are in other parts of the world. But yet, by using absolute zero, you really have a sense that this guy is really cold. This person is really, really cold. And so the truth of it comes out more so than if you had written just a normal haiku. Science fiction writing at its best examines a current problem through the lens of an imagined society. Science fiction haiku can crystallize the essence of a real moment through an imagined landscape or situation. Weightless, I Struggle with My Tie by Tom Brink. And, a lot could be written about struggling with a tie and getting it tied right? But by doing this in 0G, it just makes it more amplified. Here's one of mine. The tug of a black hole, this isolation. Now, you could read this in a couple different ways. You could look at it and say, oh, this is a pandemic poem written in the pandemic, with the isolation, and the tug of a black hole is sort of a metaphor for that sense of isolation. Or you could read it as a poem about illness, a poem about a family separation, a poem about divorce, anything that would make you feel isolated. Or you could actually read it literally as a science fiction story of being in a spaceship, going in the isolation you would feel as that spaceship is tugged into the black hole. And I think that's one of the things that I love about science fiction poetry or sci-fi is this idea that you could have different readings, and you could read it in a fantastical sense, or you could read it in a very real sense, because the best sci-fi hits you personally. Green Moonlight, The Engineer Weeps Over a Letter from Home by Joshua Gage. And again, this one is very close to being real, but the only thing that's a little odd is you have green moonlight. So now you know you're in a strange place, a strange planet. But yet that also makes you feel that you're farther away from home. And so I think it intensifies the emotion of receiving that letter from home than if it had simply been, someplace on the other part of the world. Planet Voltec, Every Snowflake the Same by Michael Dylan Welsh. And here, there's a lot that's been written about snowflakes falling, and usually they're all different, but yet on this other planet, they're all the same. And there's something about that it just allows you to examine snowflakes more closely, I think. I also want to discuss the pitfalls, the potential pitfalls when writing sci-fi, and there's a couple. First, sci-fi needs a sense of focus, or the reader could get lost. Now, this is true for any kind of haiku, really, but for science fiction haiku or fantasy haiku, you could get really lost. Folding upon himself, lost in time travel, dilemmas. So, here you've got this idea of maybe the novel, The Man Who Folded Himself, and this idea of going in time and getting all mixed up with your timeline. But it doesn't really say anything, and it's confusing. There's nothing there. So instead of that, if you focus in on a specific thing that might get screwed up by time travel, like time travel blip the day his grandparents didn't meet. So here, you're not going to even exist anymore if your grandparents don't meet, which you cause this dilemma by going back in time and somehow interrupting their meeting somehow. And so by focusing in on this specific incident, it's far more clear than just, time travel dilemmas, because what is a time travel dilemma? So that's the first thing. And there's a lot of kind of, concepts. If you're going on a scientific concept, you could get really bogged down in the big picture, and instead of focusing in on what is relevant to the poem. Another pitfall is to set the poem in a place so alien that the reader can't relate. Urgy Badal, Our Date for Binary Fission Under Double Moon Shadows. So first of all, we don't know what Urgy Badal is. Is it a planet? Is it a plant? The only thing that might, you might say, okay, energy petal, maybe it's close, so maybe it's a flower. But then you've got a situation where you have people who reproduce by binary fission, a place where there's two moons, and it's so alien, there's just no way to relate to this, really. So if you wrote something like First Blooms, assuming that Urgy Badal is a flower, but First Blooms, being pregnant under the twin moons, here's something you can relate to. It's still in a strange planet because there's double moons, but we understand first blooms. We don't need to know what kind of strange plant they have on this planet other than it's blooming. And we understand what being pregnant is. So first blooms, being pregnant under the twin moons, gives us a place to relate to this poem on a planet with two moons. Another idea might be, if you want to focus it on the binary fission, you could say twin moons, my appointment for binary fission. So here we have a sense of the moons, but time passing and appointments and a doctor's appointment or something. So again, you have a way to enter into this strange world. And finally, relevance. It's very important when you're writing a sci-fi coup, because you might read a haiku about a creature or an unknown planet, but what does that mean to us? New planet, the 25 spots of the Zuz. Okay, so I don't know what a Zuz is, but it's some sort of animal, I assume. And we're on a new planet. But what do I get from this haiku? I don't get anything from it, and I'm really not awestruck and wonder because it's such a short little thing. You're not really getting a description of this planet. And so, but yeah, you could change this slightly. You could say, new planet, the 25 eyes of the Zazazazaz. And in that sense, you've got a new planet, a strange place, and you've got 25 eyes watching you. And there's something very creepy about that. But so suddenly you are in this strange planet. And whatever this creature is, this Zazazaz, it doesn't matter what it is. All you know is something kind of strange and you're kind of scared. And so it does give you a place to react. Another even better poem about an alien on an extraterrestrial is this one by John Dumpy. The aliens' language, lacking a word for war. And see, in this one, it's a poem that's relevant to us on so many different ways. We're in an alien planet place, possibly, or the alien could be visiting our planet. It doesn't matter really. But this alien doesn't understand war because their society doesn't even have a word for war. And that's a statement on our society, which makes it much more personal. And finally, I just wanted to add a couple more sci-fi coup for the road. So as you start your own speculative haiku journey of writing them, beaming, my poems translated into Klingon by Haiku Elvis or Carlos Colon. Jedi mind trick. The bus driver doesn't ask for my transfer slip by Tanya McDonald. And I wanted to mention that these two, of course, take place in an established universe that we're all familiar with. We've all watched Star Trek. We've all watched Star Wars. So having a element from that universe in the poem gives us something to anchor to. If you create the entire universe by yourself, it's hard to condense that into a haiku. You need to focus on just one element of the strange universe that you're creating. So there's two ways to get around that to alien to relate to problem is by either using an established universe that people know, or by having something in that haiku that's familiar. Paranoid vampire. Every odd shape is a crucifix by Francis W. Alexander. Abandoned nursing home. The Mahjong tiles still move by Greg Schwartz. I wanted to have a couple of examples of horror haiku, and I did time machine rust. Even our past You Know How to Avoid Me by Megan Arkenberg. Neutrinos, She Sees Right Through Me by Jay Friedenberg. So I'd like to invite you to go on a geeko through your imagination and, imagine yourself in a different place, Camelot, Mars. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you taste?
Well, there you go. You should all be ready for the next submission period, the 1st of 2025. You have plenty of time to start thinking, and of course, many of you will be experienced sci-fi cours. So, no excuses. I'll expect great things of you. As I've mentioned, Debbie came along and read to us as part of the Cuttlefish Poets reading. The reading was due to go out in the month that we sadly lost Debbie, and I didn't want to publish it then. It didn't feel respectful. But now I'd like to bring you Deborah P. Kolodji, reading from her Cuttlefish book, Vital Signs. I'm going to let Debbie have the last word this week, so I'll see you next time for more great poetry, and don't forget to check out the show notes for all the links and the submissions for next year. But until next week, keep writing. Debbie, it's really lovely to have you back on the podcast. Hello.
It's always great to be here.
And it was also lovely to meet you in Cincinnati. That was a real treat for me. I don't always get to meet you.
That was wonderful. Even though you were there briefly, it was great to see you.
Debbie, our listeners and viewers will probably know you because you're such an active participant in the haiku community. And of course, our regulars are going to know you from the presentations you've done for us here at Poetry Pea. Debbie, you've also done some community judging for us too. You've been really, really kind to the podcast. Thank you. Now, this book you're reading from today, Vital Signs, is a collection of haiku and sci-fi-ku by you, centered on biographical. Oh, yes, I was going to come to that. It's centered on biographical images chronicling your fight against cancer. And I was going to say, and I will put a picture on the podcast and in the show notes, that the cover, Debbie, is stunning, as are all Cuttlefish books. But in your case, I believe it's a Californian condor in a lovely deep blue sky. I know why you chose this image, but would you like to tell us a little bit about your reasons?
Yes, I see the California condor as a metaphor for a cancer patient. I feel that, okay, so in the 1980s, it almost went extinct. It was down to 22 birds in the entire world, okay?
Wow.
And they went out, they rounded up all the birds in the wild, and they took them to the Los Angeles Zoo. And then the Los Angeles Zoo and the San Diego Wild Park started captive breeding programs, which is spread. They now have zoos in Oregon and in Mexico working on repopulating the condor. The condor, they started releasing them back into the wild in the 1990s. And today there are a total of 550 birds or so, and 320 or so are in the wild.
Wow.
And because the condor was fighting against its extinction, a cancer patient is fighting against their own extinction. And so, and I also, because all the condors are carefully monitored, they're all tagged because they're still endangered. It reminded me of a hospital bracelet. You go in the hospital, they put a bracelet on, they scan you for your infusions or whatever, they scan you for your blood draw, they're always scanning it. And they do the same with the condor. They track them. They are, wildlife I mean, there's people whose job it is to track condors all day. You know, they really are. So it's kind of a, you know, and it's a kind of a, you know, it's a gigantic bird, you know, it's got a 10-foot wingspan almost, you know, not quite, but 9 point something. And it's like, I saw, you know, I saw that picture that was taken by Tim Huntington of Webinar. He has a whole website of condor photos, and I saw that one and I saw it in flight, and it just sort of gave a different meaning to vital signs than your usual thought of vital signs.
Absolutely.
The last poem in my book, which is not one that we're reading today, it has to do with the condors returning to the redwoods, and they hadn't been there in over 100 years.
Oh,
But they're a sacred animal to the Yurok tribe there. And so there are now 8 condors flying over the Redwood National Forest. And, you know, there'll be more. There's a release program every 3 months. They release more birds.
are they reproducing in the wild as well?
Are they what? Yes.
Yes.
At the beginning, they actually went out and collected the eggs and took them back to the zoo. But there are some that are being hatched in the wild, and eventually they're caught and tagged. But
Wow.
you know, it's about 3 years to grow a condor to where they start. Yeah, anyway, stuff talk, condor talk. I really read a lot about condors, so I'm really interested in it. But yeah.
I love the story. Thank you very much, Debbie. We're going to now have a reading from you.
Hospital hair, the ghost of who I am. Hospital hair, the ghost of who I am. Low tide, an ochre sea star clings to the rock. Low tide, an ochre sea star clings to the rock. Alone, a nurse covers me with a warmed blanket. Alone, a nurse covers me with a warmed blanket. Bamboo wind chimes, the hollow feeling before prognosis. Bamboo wind chimes, the hollow feeling before prognosis. My day in slow motion, coy. My day in slow motion, coy. Biopsy moon, the hoot owl haunts me all night long. Biopsy moon, the hoot owl haunts me all night long.
Debbie, thank you so much for reading to us and sharing your experience with us. It's an experience that many of our viewers and listeners will know of, have experienced themselves, whether through, as I say, themselves or through loved ones. You said at the beginning that there was one poem that you weren't going to read that was about the condor, but I'm going to ask you to read it, and I wonder if it's the same one.
Forest stillness, condors return to the redwoods. Forest stillness, condors return to the redwoods.
Is that the one you were talking about at the beginning? Debbie?
Yeah, that's the one. I ended it with that. That's the only book about conjure. That's the only poem about conjures in the book. But I saw that as the end. That the conjures are returning to the redwoods, and hopefully a cancer patient at the end of their journey, if they um can fight it, they can return to a more normal life, like a life after cancer. It's what I was is hopeful. I wanted to end it with hope.